Hello everyone, today we talk about the Drilae, also known as Drilae in Georgian, an ancient tribe residing in the mountainous coastal areas of the southern shores of the Black Sea. This video is a historical unit series. The Drilae are remembered by Xenophon in his Anabasis 5-14, as we will see now, as actually the most warlike people in the entire Pontus, right? And this is interesting because there is really not too much to say about the unit type in itself, but always remember what we say in our Clausewitzian insight, that is, of course, moral force that is primarily really the core of warfare and of politics. In many ways, and this people, as warlike as it is, also has a very simple armament in the way we can grasp historically and archaeologically. And I will try to make this longer than it should be, because otherwise it would be such a brief video. After all, you could say, this guy's had shield, a spear, a helmet, greaves, right, some sort of, armor, pretty much like anybody, right? There is nothing especially qualifying in this regard, but this is in fact not the point. But anyway, I make these videos, say this type of unit videos, especially for sort of completing the Achaemenid auxiliary forces during more or less the age of the Persian wars, right? The wars in Greece that can help illustrating what, say, Xerxes' armies could look like, right? Even in this, say, secondary, like lesser-known populations that, as a matter of fact, are not even listed as being part of those expeditions, but that would have contributed for the sake of, say, benefits received from the Achaemenids. Whose central power was not even that far away from Pontus, after all. And being co-opted, having special favors, like getting sort of more, say, a greater political compaction. Mostly this is the point, like the greater empires want essentially to stabilize certain regions that, like in this case, do not spark for particular political stability, because instability is negative for everything, for trade, for like the general resources that you must invest just to keep these guys at bay. And so tributes or simply subsidies, depending on how you want to see it, the thing, are the key word, obviously enough. And the Drilae would have just been also, this is why these examples, I think, even as repetitive as they can be, right, in some circumstances. We made already some videos about some Anatolian, Caucasian tribes from the same time that, after all, do not tell us much, because they wouldn't actually do much, in fact, in a, say, broader historical or strategical sense. But that exemplified pretty well, again, the type of average trooper that you can find pretty much in all the ancient sanitary world, and that really does not differ, in fact, from other peoples. Like, that the exception in here were truly the Greeks in some ways, and we have also exaggerated the different distinction of the phalanx from the other populations, but it is true that they were balanced in a different way, and they had a greater sense of state, of public authority, but also that capacity of preserving, at least to a degree, a level of, in fact, more even distribution of wealth that could provide with that level of homogeneity that the phalanx as heavy infantry, so something expensive, was in fact capable of even countering the same populations, even the greater universal empire, the kings of kings. But when you look at the background, even in Europe, as the Germans, the Celts, the the italics, the iterations, the variants, etc., you realize in many ways that there wasn't this radical difference among one another, if any, at all, like in the, say, in the essentials of their armament, right? And then you could have different fashion, different styles, but a guy equipped, even just like when my military history mentor used to say, like, in order to say what is answering the question, like better, for example, a curved or straight blade to fight. It's like asking whether a black or a white cat is better catching a mouse. Like, it is virtually irrelevant. If you look at the, insane level of polarization towards, say, in pop culture from YouTube, around topics like, in fact, ancient or medieval warfare, around things like, in fact, look at this weapon, how did this weapon work? We have to make tests to find out. Well, do you even realize how people thought at the time? Like, in how, say, more hierarchically relevant by definition, large, say, just collective training in the first place is, like moral forces, like unit tactics, and that are not the result, like as a simple sum of what kind of weapons these people use, but a multiplier of the same, because of the interaction between, after all, like men, first of all, that are not just their weapons, and so moral forces that you can't even quantify, and that's why it's a deterministic, materialistic, and obviously simplistic monofactorial explanations often, even when they want to mask themselves for something more complex, are actually out there, and they're so popular among the lesser educated. But also in the sense how, underrated the same attainments of, in fact, peoples like these that we also do not remember, as we were saying, much otherwise, like, can be considered for, in that word, remaining, like, distinguishing themselves. You see, if you flatten of course, the material cultural differences, of course, what you get is the Clausewitzian paradigm, but also the traditional one. It is peoples differ from one another in moral superiority or inferiority, right? That's the actual discriminant that we should recover also just as a moral and a scientific principle, because we do not see anything, right, when getting to accuracy and historical, say, correctness in the scientific sense, but this, right? The rest is just a sort of pathetic attempt to, again, find this strange, like, to first of all distract from the most important human factor, that is not random, it's not individual. Sometimes this thing is so ingrained that they say, okay, but let's skip the human factor, like, because we want to know what guy wins if they are equal, and nobody understands what that's supposed to mean even in the first place. Except this guy uses this weapon and this guy the other, right? Here, like, it's not just basically all military history or the laws of reciprocity in the Clausewitzian theory, but literal political illiteracy materializes as a consequence. It means that you do not understand why people fight with one another, and consequently also why they do it in a certain way, which of course constantly changes on the basis of the circumstances. If there would be a disadvantage due exclusively to weapons, first of all, we would live in a completely different world in the realm of physics, right? And secondly, why would a guy keep finding a way rather than another and not adapting, as actually the entire military history fundamentally gets down to constantly? But unfortunately, that's the point, right? It's the average person, especially the ones who act as if they were more, strategically literate because, they played video games in their teenage or God knows what, feel the need apparently to stress that, oh my God, it's this. It's just like my intellectual maturity, say, realizes itself in this sort of cheap, everybody else's sort of low-key, complete lack of approach to any serious historical education whatsoever, but much more. Again, this is a scientific problem. If you don't understand this, you may have had severe deficiencies in your scientific education in primary school. Now, the problem also with this is, of course, that we do not know in practice. We're not told by the sources normally has this guy's fought concretely, like just also as a medievalist, everybody knows that the late medieval fencing treatises that are just, like essentially the first true ones from which you can get from how people really fought in a more, at least they do not say that. That's the point I'm making. How depicted their fencing does not tell you whether that they're actually reliable or not. Like, it's not that if you read a battle account of the same era, that's literally how they explain you how the battle goes, and exactly also because of this hierarchical relation we highlighted, they don't tell you like learning those things. First of all, may not those looking at those illustrations and explanations may not actually tell you at all how people would fight, but also it would still tell you nothing about, say, fighting individually. It would still tell you nothing about how wars were fought in the first place, and that's at zero. Like, it's the lowest level of historical literacy. And people often confuse that as the top level of military historical expertise, which is absolutely absurd. Leaving aside, most people can't even define the difference between military history and the art of war. So let's not open that box again. But looking at these units here, I think is interesting because, first of all, they're fruit of an approximation. As we've seen in other videos, first of all, the picture is sort of conjectural, unless we have a very detailed imagery connected with it. But it's also like sometimes maybe a propagandistic image that, or just one that was rendered artistically in a certain way. There's really nothing wrong in propagandizing a certain thing. Propaganda is not intrinsically bad. It can be good or bad. It depends on what it contains. Also historically, the sense is we do not know, right? So we should be a bit wiser. So this guy, you see it, has a very simple armament, right? We are again looking at essentially tribesmen, right? There is a level of civilization, of course, in the Middle East you would have acquired, like especially looking at the development of civilization in the millennia, like these peoples were not complete brutes or savages, but say that the distance from that was pretty short. We're looking at Northeast Asia Minor, as we were saying before, and we talk about the Drilae because Xenophon, as we were saying, describes them to us. And they're described as having a gerra, that is a wicker shield, presumably because at least of Persian shape, because in the Achaemenid army this type of shield, as you know, was pretty common. But here gerra, we don't have to think necessarily that there is a categorical classification that all the gerrae were like all the same or whatever. We're not really even sure. We'll talk about these shields in the future, but they could vary. Like, as I always say, there are not so many ways to make shields in the first place, and the way these different names come about in the sources, of course, yes, a difference in language, a difference in distance with people, but in the functionality, the differences are not enormous. This in the picture is a fairly large shield that is inspired naturally, also in shape, to the some of the more typical, like the Achaemenids had things like this, but this is similar to the Theban shape like that you find on the on the Theban coins, in iconography in general at the time of Lector, etc. The idea is that this is not a particularly heavy shield, especially considering it's made of wicker. It could be made of other material. Of course, they had wooden shields, they had, say, leather covers, etc. But this, guys, we will see now, runs on a pretty tough terrain, is dynamic, has the capacity, of course, to... We're looking at a heavy infantryman, fundamentally, especially if you look at the spear, and the fair length, all that can keep cavalry at bay. We've seen this in other videos, like this region was particularly crossed since the early times of cavalry and chariotry as well, by, in fact, a lot of mounted troops, barbarians mostly, coming from the semi-nomadic steppes. And therefore the sedentary and sedentarized populations, because some of them actually did come from the same, many were the mix of some local, mixed with Indo-Europeans, with Semitic peoples, etc., would essentially counter them to defend their own settlements. They had come from them, but they had adapted to a sedentary lifestyle. We've seen, again, the other unit type that we made very similar to this is the Kalubas infantrymen. I made a video just a month ago or so that illustrates pretty much the same idea, that they had fairly long spears, but of course, like any other people around, like they were troops with shorter spears / javelins as well. They of course had sorts of lighter infantries than the ones we see, say, in an Atlantic context. Longer spear does not mean tougher infantry, if not in relation to the same people that, however, the same people's infantrymen with shorter spears, but because of course the collective training required to wield such spears effectively is greater, is higher, right? You need also larger amounts of troops for, say, the spears to be effective, because of course there are ways from adversaries that are more, say, individually skilled to simply close in, and these guys are not, they're tribesmen, but they're essentially farmers, right? They don't have, like, they're not primarily warriors, and even if they are actually habituated, as we we're just saying, to pretty sort of warlike situation, and had often to adapt, in fact, to this kind of external interferences, to say the least, they would specialize a bit against cavalry, mostly in a communitary sense. It's also with this level of collective training. We'll look better now at their political and social organization, but there would be all kind of spears. And again, the fact that there are say pikes at some point, the pike, remember, has nothing special. It's literally a longer spear than the average. That's how we define a pike. There is no other definition. There is no technicality about it. The main function of the pike is historically stopping cavalry, right? You can engage, of course, other infantry, anybody, but the sense is that that's literally the only weapon that stops cavalry, unmasked with, again, that level of cohesion, etc., which is actually the one that makes the units. Having this kind of long spears, we find them like in pretty much everywhere in this context of the ancient war, doesn't actually mean anything in terms of the cohesion that the troops will have in combat, right? Having longer spears, maybe as long as the ones of the Macedonian Sarisopharoi, does not mean that you're going to fight as a Macedonian phalanx, right? Nor, of course, these peoples had any, say, statal capacity to do that. By the way, the Macedonian phalanx was an incredibly expensive thing. Just the Sarissai, where we will talk about how they were actually made. They were insanely expensive. you think it's just a fact. No, there were some characteristics this weapon must have in order to be functionally employed in the phalanx that really makes, in that sense, the Greeks that special and unique on their own. But at the same time, still heavy infantry. So technically, also these guys can engage it. Right. This is also how the Romans did it. It's how any other people would do it. Because, as I was saying in the beginning, this obsession to sort of technicistically, materialistically, and deterministically separate peoples and saying, this heavy infantry was, just had to win anyway because it was this type of infantry, It's a concept that doesn't make any sense in the annals of military history, right? More or less, the heavy infantries of this world were employed in the same tactical function. That's why they are called heavy infantries in the first place, because they can hold the ground. Naturally, and we've seen this often also with the video on the Turophoroi, etc., many of these guys would actually be Turophoroi. You know that the Turophoros is not just the Hellenic-looking sort of hybrid between a peltast and a spearman. It's also like in the actual language how it was employed, also in this time, and especially as it would be universal in the Hellenistic era for this kind of troops. In fact, just a guy with a noble shield, a spear, a couple of spears / javelins, and that's it. And Anatolia was particularly endowed exactly with all these sort of scattered tribes that were pretty warlike. They were into this kind of ambushes, guerrilla, raiding warfare, etc. And they were relatively cheap, like in terms cost benefits. Like they put up a good performance. They were not as tough again as the heavier infantries of the ancient war, but they still could hold the ground. They still could be employed in that tactical function. And so, especially for peoples who did not have the phalanx, like the same Achaemenids, that had better infantry than this, of course, but that weren't so that dramatically heavier in general, well, this would do, And you could employ them, especially as a big empire, as auxiliaries, in so many other ways, and especially on the frontier, because the best way to fight would keep these guys at bay on the frontier, sort of intervening with their similars, right? So with their neighbors in the first place. We've seen in the video about the Calibus how Xenophon explains that Cyrus at some point had intervened to properly sedate a war that had broken out between, I think, the Armenians and the Calibus, and that was negative, and of course entailed like stepping into this guy's politics, their internal fragmentation. And indeed, the Drilae are very similar. As far as we know, the Drilae were constantly engaged in warfare with the inhabitants of Trapezus on the Black Sea coast. It was probably a port. So the Drilae were, a bit more mountaineers, right, living in the hinterland and in quite inaccessible places that they exploited for, in fact, their predatory activities as good, cattle breeders and stealers, and that's always the craft you're involved in. The Trapezuntians, by the way, had their own hinterland as well. They were a Kartvelian tribe as well, living in the hinterland of the Trapezus area properly. In 401 BC, the Drilae's territory is invaded by the Hellenic mercenaries, essentially disengaging from the Achaemenid civil war. That, of course, is most famously documented in the Anabasis, that is properly the account of the expedition in the hinterland, that thus, that they would reach the Black Sea, right, from the famous Thalata cry, right, by, we are seen as Greeks the sea again, because they had been quite involved somewhere else, and they had to cross all these mountainous territories. And of course, the author of the Anabasis is the Hellenic soldier and historian Xenophon. Xenophon describes the Drilae, as we were saying in the beginning, as the most warlike among the Pontic tribes, which is a good, compliment for them, because, of course, like, they were all a bit warlike and quite competitive with one another. And so these guys were really that ferocious. In their terrain was mirroring their own qualities, as it was rugged, inaccessible, therefore also quite difficult to fight in. Naturally, their equipment would have mirrored this. We can imagine, particular footwear adapted to the, tough, mountainous terrain. Agility of these troops, as we've seen, like, they would have made great, properly mountaineers. There is a way to mountaineer warfare specifically, and these forces are underrated, especially in their attack shock function. Sometimes, again, they were overall light. They were not particularly heavy. Right? What can we say about their armor, for example? Like, we know they had greaves. Here, the guy is wearing a Paphlagonian helmet, as was another Pontic region. The spears, again, we discussed them, but overall, like, you can imagine other types of especially signed weapons like axes, also javelins. So this kind of more shock weapons to hit and run, fundamentally. This would have pertained to the lighter elements of the host, and the heavier one, and of course they could switch it to a degree, but there would be some tactical segmentation, of course, mirroring the social one, right? Especially, like, they weren't a particularly rich people, so they didn't have, in fact, many political structures. Would fundamentally just, categorically separate various fighting classes. So it's likely that they had surely something within their own tribal organization, but it would follow more age than other places, because there is probably a biological differentiation. The men, like the guys in the 20s, are sort of lighter, more elastic, agile. The one in their 30s, those who have survived, they are tougher, they have better equipment, they've seen it all before, they're more reliable. So this is a bit the same segmentation that originally you see, for example, in the Roman triplex Achaeus, right? And that eventually becomes, instead of mostly a democratic issue, right? So tribally speaking, it would come closer to the age gap rather than anything else. Now, of course, I'm forcing that these peoples had something similarly democratic, like they weren't, again, that primitive, but they also had quite probably also not this enormous tactical specialization. That's just a tendency that within the population. Xenophon notes, by the way, that the Drilae capital was so well fortified that even skilled Hellenic hoplites could not conquer it. Now, the interesting aspect of this, of course, is always that the heavier infantries were used as stormtroopers. They were the ones to actually climb ladders, to have the physicality in armor to be well protected, to survive essentially whatever they were being targeted with, and so on. And so the inaccessibility of the Drilae's nests is fascinating, because they had this fame of pirates, as we will see now, not just as mountaineers, right? You have mountains close to the sea, as a matter of fact, so you have a bit of both going on. But definitely they're not a maritime people in general, just raiders, robbers, brigands around the area. And they would collect, store their loot in these fortified emplacements, as always, pretty typical. So the Drilae are primarily pastoralists. They, however, had enough surplus to develop their own centers, also in construction somehow. Xenophon characterizes the Drilae's country as mountainous and challenging, also to navigate, like with its inhabitants being the most warlike among those living near the Black Sea, so actually making the coastland a dangerous place as well. Right? There were lots of goods that were crossing some branches of the Silk Road, probably across Anatolia, also towards the north, various brooklets, and at the openings of these valleys on the Pontic coast, you would naturally have a lot of struggle for control, and also some amphibious capacity to attack the vessels, etc. Arrian, so much later source, 600 years later, so in a Roman context now, because the land was part of the Roman Empire, mentions that the descendants of Xenophon's Drilae were still present in his time, yet they were known as the Sanni, S-A-N-W-N-I. And Arrian describes these people in their... The work is the Periplus, right? As fiercely combated. So they had maintained that policy, because the Anatolian hinterland is that wild. Think about these Aurians that survived, like after several centuries of or more, like of civilized domination. But the hinterland is something else. This is very typical of many contexts, really. But Anatolia may be the most active one. Remember what was said before about the Tureophoroi, right? And especially in this case, where you have Hellenic colonization in the coastline, it's a quite important, let's say, political, social, and also military organization, etc. The Greeks do not care about the hinterland because they're barbarians. Hellenic culture does not really, like in terms of organizational forms, let's say, reach more than a few tens of kilometers interland everywhere, right? There may be, I don't know, some of these guys, of course, purchasing or stealing Hellenic arms and armor, also the Roman ones later, but fundamentally they remain just on their own and doing their stuff. And none of these empires really cared, right? Especially the Romans in the East were following essentially the Hellenic pattern. They weren't colonizing as intensely as they would do in the West, where the hinterland was, as you know, heavily Romanized, also in language and in numbers of actual settlers. Here it continues sort of the Greek Alexandrine way, and these guys are out there, and there are examples of, say, primitive populations in places. Think about the Celtic fringe in Europe as well, places like Armorica or the northwest of Britain, etc. There are the Romans for a long time, but nothing seemed to change a lot. This is a bit the same, right? Except there is a sharper contrast because, of course, Asia Minor was in some parts, at least along the coast, very advanced, right? I made a couple of videos about Cappadocia, other had something about Roman Asia incoming, but I interrupted that series about the Roman provinces. I would like to resume at some point. And we've seen, of course, how the hinterland was different from some of the most advanced places on the coast. So it's not surprising, really, that in Arrian's times you have still warlike peoples in the hinterland, because the Romans would simply let them do whatever they wanted. And why? Because they were strategically relevant. They didn't have any capacity to threaten the Roman government. They were warlike because they were just cattle raiders and among each other, and they mostly would fight against one another. That's an interesting thing. And in Arrian tells us, interestingly enough, that while the Romans had actually obliged the Sanni/Drilae to pay tribute to them, they would manage to evade it due at least to their reputation as pirates, which tells you how, of course, this was, on the far east of the Roman Empire, frontier area, again, like relatively primitive area, and the Romans wouldn't have the capacity to simply control everything there. So again, this people was not particularly threatening. They weren't really destabilizing the area excessively. Like a Roman presence could essentially reduce them to obedience, but there wasn't even that much of a problem. They were just pirates after all, and on a small scale, in an area that was also troubled in times of, like we've seen it with the video about the Roman battle array at this point, including the same Arians won against the Sarmatians. In fact, always the same problem. Like these peoples, like see across the millennia, the pastoralist nomads from the steppes were coming to infest these places, and so they would help destabilizing the region, so that the Drilae would exploit it in turn. Just not because they were happy that the Sarmatians were passing by, but because if there was something to loot, right, and to, let's say, to profit from temporarily. That's how poor their surplus expectations and means alternatively also were to peace, that they would sort of join the looting and the broader spirit, even though, again, they, as senators, they weren't happy that the Sarmatians were around either. They just united the unavoidable with what they could get out of it. So you understand what's the tone overall. Arrian says that, by the way, still in his time, we're in the 2nd century AD, the Drilae were hostile against the Trapezuntans, which also tells you like how old can rivalries be, especially among neighbors. And so really, also the slowness, like here times changed. We started from Achaemenid times, from, you have Alexander, and then you have, the Romans. Centuries passes, but these guys are always sort of harassing one another on the same provincial basis as neighbors, and that really never ends. Arrian tells us also something very interesting regarding the Drilae fortified settlements. These were the centers of their rulers that, of course, lacked any overlord, right, except Rome, at least, meaning that as peoples, they, of course, recognized themselves in this confederal way, without, I think, many central institutions of any sort. Hence, they didn't even have this single ruler, and they were probably, in fact, very jealous of their own internal autonomies. They had surely some shared, pasture land, or at least something they would also fight on, but they would have the regulations to exploit the terrain in in this cooperative fashion. And likely they would have some cavalry capacity too that we shouldn't simply dismiss. They were not particularly heavy cavalries at this point, nor in Achaemenid times, but this sort of medium cavalries, like mixing, like looking at this guy essentially, but on horseback, like still making something, still being expandable, but in a positive sense. And of course, the possibility, however, of disposing of large numbers of cavalry was likely another thing. At least there would have been maybe many light horsemen, but not something particularly more robust available in a structured sense, because we don't see it even in their infantries, as we were saying before. Again, they're mountaineers, they're pastoralists. They have something in terms of surplus to equip themselves, to organize themselves, to have aristocracies ruling them, but it's very different from having like a sound, hard, like, military hierarchy and organization. And they simply live like this, right? Fighting, killing, working in the fields, breeding their cattle, and so on, without too many changes apparently in the centuries. Then, of course, consider that we know very few about them in the first place. So this is due in part to the fact that they were that simple of a people overall, but it surely there was something more interesting also in terms of military organization that we can't see and we can just guess, right? In any case, if you had seen an Armament army of the 5th century BC, there would have been some of these guys around, especially considering that they were so warlike, apparently, more than any other Pontic people. And that makes them good choice for your forces. Also considering that since, as we've seen, they're not so dangerous in general, and the fact that they're so warlike because they are overall, in a sense, politically or strategically ineffective, they're actually easier to co-opt as auxiliaries. It's like, I don't know, the Roman. We do not know of Drilae, but we understand they would have been absorbed by the Roman military system in a way, just like all the other subjects would. But think about, I don't know, the Germans that were sort of quite warlike, but say they wouldn't pose essentially a threat until at least they confederated into something larger, and it's later history. But they made excellent auxiliaries without being essentially much of a threat. Even though, of course, like the comparison is they would rebel, at least in the Germans were more, as you know, disobedient to Rome and creating problems on the frontier, also starting rebellions from within the same auxiliaries. But aside from that, they were generally obedient, while still being good troops. Here, we're not looking at the same thing. We are looking at sort of less, let's say, less heavy troops in general, something much less cohesive. They're not like the Middle Eastern communities do not have the same level of tribal cohesion that the Germans would have, because they were much, in that sense, more primitively brutal, warlike, and cohesive, like pushed by the migrations, forced into that toughness by the places, the general scarcity of resources. That's all a different thing, right? Here we appreciate these infantries mostly in the context of, again, the Achaemenids ruled on this. So I'm making this video just to show how like we know of them, and they were part of this world, even if we don't definitely wake up every day thinking about the Drilae. But they do deserve their place in military history. Here I think this guy can be a good reminder of the fact that they existed, that he will be stored in the military historical units series of Schwerpunkt, and someone will learn of his people and maybe, I don't know, get into it more thoroughly. But we do not know anything, actually. That's the problem, as we were saying before. Like, archaeologically, yes, we could find out more, and there is surely more, but overall, like, we barely know they existed. Right here, just a couple of of historians and commanders, this is interesting, tell us that they did exist. And this is not to be underestimated, because at least the information that we get is not just quite matching with one another. Naturally, Arrian would have known Xenophon, etc., but the general profile is quite plausible in general, and the also this details about their warlikeness, their fortified positions, etc., is relevant, is something we can definitely imagine, picture, and just reflect on, again, the capacity of these people to simply preserve themselves into nowhere places, because this would have really been something very peripheral. You know that also in later Byzantine times, there's actually a lot of warfare in these frontiers, but overall the peoples are relatively spent. Like they wouldn't, we would have, well, of course, in the early Middle Ages especially, there is a general level of exhaustion, but these are Georgian populations fundamentally that will have their own military history, will have their own way of war. I made a video about medieval Georgian warfare. We'll talk more about that because it is really interesting. And as such, you realize that especially the decentralized positions are very underrated when you think about that. Like this, the Caucasus in general is very much this historically political. You never find, you do have some statehood of some sort, but it's always very diluted. It's always very yes, there's later on, especially like a dynastization. Here, the sources are explicit that Drilae did not really have a central leader control, and that obviously makes a lot of sense. Later on, there would be some sort of more aristocratic leadership, and also towards a dynastic direction in medieval times. But it's not like these places would ever be like ruled by a central power of their own that would substantially manage to impose itself uniformly on the territory as a single polity with a centralized system. No, right? And they're always that on their own, let's say, and as a consequence, they are, in this sense, even more interesting because it makes you think of how, like, what their understanding could be of the surrounding politics as well. Like, as a people, like, you know that there are more powerful rulers. They actually come to extend their control on your same territory. The question is, how do you react to this? Like, how do you think yourself in the world? And you could think of limited horizons, but it's unlikely. Some of these people also become mercenaries. They serve abroad, and especially these ones, as we were pointing out before, would have been really that likely as the more warlike in the entire, known as the more warlike in the entire Pontic, say at least Anatolian Pontic area. Like, they would find someone who would employ them. Well, you gotta admit that I'm pretty good at stretching the video without really saying much, because unfortunately that's all what we have. But again, I like to make these observations in general, not just because of the encyclopedistic completion that arrives from having these videos and sort of relaxing at times, because just making videos, like the more important ones, is complex, right? It's tough. Like yesterday I was making that video on the Iraqi, which was very pleasant, and it came out well, but say, oof, like it's like knowing that you have to talk for 2 hours and a half on this, like with this level of, you know, you have to be there with your mind in order to do it. It's not that light, right? You always have to be ready for, also physically for it. And okay, look, yesterday, I say this because I do make physical activity. As a matter of fact, I have programs of hundreds of push-ups a day, but sometimes, some days you feel physically like, oh my god, I'm so tired, or I don't know, I haven't slept enough, or whatever. It's not a few. Like, so I like to sometimes just express this mood whenever I make these chats, fundamentally. about these types of warriors, but you see how there's always something interesting to learn. Like, it's never empty words, it's never empty takes. You always have the possibility, of course, of reiterating certain points that are important for the channel, are important methodologically, especially here about ancient warfare in this sense, because with medieval history we start having enough information to have, like, I don't know, a pretty fair picture about, or even excessive amount of detail for, like, describing what a people is like, right, or what type of trooper is. For the ancient world, you have to be slightly more careful because you lack the info. So it's not like talking medieval history. It's something slightly different, and it is in a way you have to make the audience aware of the implications of such sort of bridges that you find, right? Because being habituated to medieval warfare, the most, let's say, obvious point is, again, it's more like the confusion of all the information we have, even in terms of unit types. Here I, for example, am pretty thorough as far as ancient history is concerned, so that I talk about these guys, for example, that people would say, but why would you even do that? And, like, what do you care about? With medieval history, the main problem is going beyond the sort of more identitaristic attachment, which is present out there also for ancient history a lot, telling the truth, right? You know that I like Indo-European content. I do, let's say, talk about Indo-European history and religion, values, and all this stuff, but at the same time, I realize that many people don't really care about the history of it, first of all, but especially when we talk about military history, they don't see the point of the as you understand, in my case, it's not the technical aspect, right? You can't say it's technical, what you really see here. It's more like understanding the political background of these peoples, how they were organized, consequently, like what their military looked like. And I love that exercise because it allows you to measure like the actual consistency of these peoples, whereas most people go for military historical content just, I want to hear about these people because, I don't know, they were my ancestors, and you just want to go out there and sort of act as if you were relevant because of that, and objectively not even caring, actually not wanting to hear what these ancestors were about in any way, because it's too challenging in terms of, first of all, what they actually were, what they actually believed, and the fact that it's, let's be honest, like, most people do it just for aestheticism. They don't even understand their own history, the one of their own country. That absolutely zero. I don't think that having parents or, going to school per se is enough. Like, we must have at least a particular type of both to have even just a minimally good historical information and general understanding. People tend to flatter themselves very much in this sense, which I personally don't understand, right? Because I am very judgmental, but I also don't go out there saying, oh my god, I don't tell you anything about my own background, and I'm not really, I'm telling you when I'm biased, and I try to be as objective as possible, because we're all biased, and there's nothing you can do about that. Nobody can do it in the first place, but say talking about it is just a first step for being fair about the same appreciation, right? I think that whenever you're able to look through what people study history for, you are able, like, to to fix a lot of things. And that's also why Schwerpunkt is not so much liked, because I presume people would like a video like this, for example, to be overloaded. First of all, nobody can do more than I'm doing, because there is literally nothing more unless you just pick like an archaeology survey and you study what these guys look like. A single type of weapons have been found, and you try to reconstruct a much more complex picture, but that doesn't tell us much. Well, it could tell us much more about it. Surely there is something more militarily interesting, but at that point it would be also a very technical video. This stuff I think most people would like to hear, because I found whichever video I make, usually, especially about this more exotic ones, there are people coming out from the mists of the YouTube commentaries that otherwise would, as they would never otherwise comment ever for any reason except when they are mentioned, and so that becomes like, you know, that they exist, that they're still alive. They're probably, in this case, they have something against the Trapezuntans. There's just a little joke, but the sense is that I perceive from any side that what people would like to hear is always that their ancestors were the heroes of the situation. And at least you should talk just cool stuff about them. I understand that it's flattering when say, okay, well, talk about your country and that's a positive thing, etc. But I noticed that there is a decency, like in some popular, at least I don't get many Western. It is true that many Westerners have been sort of denaturated. They don't look very much at their path. That they like more exoticistic topics, and they take pride of that sort of challenge to their intellectual. I know it all, but here's a new thing. It's a new stuff to learn. It's good, actually. Sometimes this does come with a bit more of, like, we do not know, or we're not really interested even in our own history anymore. Other times they are instead silent, because hopefully, at least this is what I hope, because I never really got the answer from the beginning of Schwerpunkt. Like, they actually know their deal, they keep it for themselves. Because the silence in the historical interaction, you would think that after 2,000 videos, like, people come here and that they actually talk about, history. They criticize me for, oh my god, like, this content specifically, this information is wrong, or this zero. You know what I mean by zero? Right? I don't get anything of that kind. If I ever do something like that, it's usually still like it's actually clothed as a historical thing. It's carrying like as always, but a too heavy bias of some sort that has no real place with properly the historical intent that it may even knowledge that was displayed there. And what could we say? It's never easy to talk history. That much I realized, that it's always a matter of how willing you are to be, say, honest with yourself, but at levels that really challenge you directly. So many aspects that are difficult to. That's why I'm vocal. I'm just diluting further, like to have a decently long video. But these reflections are still relevant, because otherwise why are we here? Like, let's be honest, how many of you are actually interested in the Drilae? Yes, maybe, but not to listen to me speaking for up to this point. If you made it up to this point, my compliments. Thanks for increasing my stats, and that's perfectly fine. I'm glad. It means that what I say has some relevance, and so if this works, it's I'm glad. I know that there is someone who listens till the end and says that these are the best parts, but there are a few. Like, I see it from the stats anyway. What else to say? Let's stop it here. We will look naturally at other similar populations to the Drilae, just the Calubas, and there are a bunch of others that are really, some are more famous, Actually, these are from the Eastern Anatolian side of the story. It's not that. They were also the least. They were the more primitive, first of all, the least politically relevant, the least famous, also as far as the aforementioned like participation in the Achaemenid armies. So they were really like, of course, when mobilized by the empire, being the usual aristocrats with some retinue, especially as horsemen, and then some levy infantry, mostly, like in this case. That's easy to guess, right? But there are so many different populations in Asia Minor that are this documented. Let's say there are also way more documented and so different, and that's why this is an area that deserves this attention, because it was never so central. It was never like a power, like from, at least if you look back at the Hittite times, you have something like that, but after that you never really have something definitively impacting in these areas. And at least in the ancient medieval times, you have the Sultanate of Economides, but they were always frontiers, right? They were always, again, pretty unstable places in so many ways. So again, it's difficult. The interland was that sort of subjected to other rulers. That's why this is also interesting. I think it's very it's very convenient to appreciate these singular units, because they make you understand what the whole mosaic was really about. And that's again why I do this stuff. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.